Mr. Bison lives! Mr. Bison lives! Mr. Bison lives!
This video is designed to help you start using your mnemonic to create your own commentaries and structure them, as well as remember all the things that you need to address. You may remember the example mnemonic that I made in the sample lesson. If you don't, it was: first make Tom name 5 victorious slayers producing significant royal instability here down under. Just to remind me of the letters F, M, T, N, V, S, P, S, R, I, H, and D. So that's the mnemonic I will be using in this example. For this demonstration, I will be using a poet by Australian poet Ken Slessor called Beach Burial. Generally, in an unseen commentary in paper 1, you will not receive any information beyond the poet's name and the title of the poem. So I'm going to work on that assumption that I don't know anything about Kenneth Slessor or about this poem, and thereby try to make this as authentic as possible. So, starting off, we would start with our first impression. So the first thing I would do is read through the poem and then come up with kind of what's my first impression, what do I think this poem is about just from reading it once. And to me, it quite clearly is a poem about obviously soldiers and war and about dying, and there's a strong sense of us and them and of loss and mourning for those who have died. So that's kind of would be my first general impressions. So then really it's a matter of, once you go through your entire annotations, you kind of think, is that first impression valid or not? And if so, what has created that first impression? So the next step is to explore the mood and the tone of the poem to represent the letters M and T. And I would say the mood is quite gloomy. There's that sense of loss that we talked about before. There's an element of reverence, and then underbuilding some sense of sorrow in the poem. In terms of the tone, it seems somber, respectful, reverent. There's a sense of someone who feels a bit of awe for this moment and for the things that have happened around here. If we move now to the narrative stands in the passage, there's a sense of us and them built up through the pronouns used by the speaker. He refers to them throughout the passage, and I think them refers to both the people that seem to be on the same side, but also who are the theirs referred to here, but there's also a sense of enemies. As enemies they fought, so now we're looking at the other side, or fought with us, or neither. So there's a sense of there's us and there's them, and there's them who are on the other side, establishing some sort of connection or disconnect between the speaker and the other characters in the story. If we then move to the structure of the poem, which is represented by the F for form, we can see obviously that it's a 5-stanza poem. Each stanza has 4 lines. The meter is a little bit trickier. It's largely iambic, giving the poem sort of an elegiac quality. There's an element of lamentation about it because of that, but it's not. Obviously, we can't say that it's clearly pentameter or hexameter. Because it does vary a little bit, and the iambs are not very strong, but it does give that kind of sense of an elegy to the poem. If we look at the progression of ideas between stanzas, it's quite clear that the first stanza has a sense of orientation. We get a place, and we get the kind of the characters of the dead sailors. The second stanza combines the violence of warfare with the sorrow of the bodies lost in the ocean and in the sand. The third stanza then moves into more of a burial type setting, and we get detailed description of the crosses in this fourth stanza. and how the sense of the drowned people being there. And then finally in the fifth stanza we get that kind of equalizing nature of death and the fact that we're all equal when it comes to the bitter end. The next step then is to move on to vocabulary and look at the words, hence the letter V. And in this case, identify the words that are kind of interesting, that you think are a bit ambiguous, maybe a bit difficult, and see what can you do working with those particular words. So if we look in the very first line, the softly and humbly, the convoys of the dead, that would be kind of interesting to explore a bit further. In the second stanza, it's interesting how the gunfire is described both as a sob and a clubbing. And then there's that sort of interesting, so someone has the time to pluck them from the shallows and bury them in burrows. It's as if they're kind of habitating in their death bed. The third stanza is interesting because there seems to be kind of a conflict here between the almost violence in the driven stake and the intense loss and mourning, where we get the perplexity, the bewildered pity, and the words that choke as they begin. In the fourth stanza, I think the phrase "the ghostly pencil" is kind of interesting, in contrast to or as an echo, I guess, of the fading paint and the dripping purple, etc., on the crosses, and the inscription that's kind of fading because no one knows who this seaman supposedly is. The last stanza might be a little bit more straightforward in terms of vocabulary. We get that sense of what the meaning is of the poem. I guess the only phrase we haven't talked about, I've described this as a 5-stanza poem up to this point. We should, however, note the almost afterthought or postscript El Alamein at the end there. Now the IB never expects you to know geographical or historical detail at any depth, and in fact if the phrase was there and of importance to the passage, it probably would be there as a kind of a definition on the end. But those of you that do history or have an historical interest might be familiar with El Alamein as one of the big kind of turning battles of World War II. So it might be important to note that in terms of, we know we're in the Gulf of the Arabs, we know El Alamein is in North Africa, which would be one in the Arab countries. So we could presumably, this poem certainly could connect to that idea. If we then carry on to the S in mnemonic, we find we should be exploring slang or particular jargon in the poem.